I'm Dr. Bill Bass. I'd like to welcome you to the third in the series of 4 lectures dealing with techniques of determining the age, race, sex, and stature of human skeletal material. This is the third in the series of lectures, and we're going to cover today how you determine the race of a skeleton and also how you can calculate the stature of the individual. As we get started on talking about race, let me go back and summarize just a minute some of the things that we've discussed in the first 2 lectures. If you remember in the first lecture, we talked about how you determine the age of an individual. You can literally determine the age by looking at any part of the skeleton, determining or depending on how old that individual is. For example, as a child, we have the eruption of the teeth and the closure of the epiphyses. These are the maturity indicators or the growth processes of the body. Then, roughly at about age 20, the system begins to show a series of degenerative changes, or the skeleton begins to wear out. And we talked about such things as osteone counting, osteoarthritic lipping, and changes in the pubic symphysis. Now, when we talked about how you determine the sex of an individual or a skeleton, the best area to determine the sex is from the pelvis. Second best area is the skull. You can use the long bones, the bones of the arms or the legs. However, these are not as good as certainly the pelvis. Now, as we get into determining the race of a skeleton, the only area that you can use is the skull, and you not only have to have the skull, but you should also have the face. The face is that part of the skeleton that shows anatomical variations between the major races on the earth. Now, let's go over here and look at the 3 skulls that we have here that represent the 3 major racial groups that we want to talk about today. This skull here is the skull of a Negroid or black individual. This skull right here is the skull of an American Indian. American Indians are basically Mongoloid, the same as our Japanese and Chinese or individuals from Southeast Asia. And this partial skull over here is the skull of a Caucasoid or white individual. Now let's look at some of the criteria. Should you find a skull and you wonder whether that individual is a Negroid, a Mongoloid, or a Caucasoid individual, there are certain anatomical features that you can look at. Let's start with the Caucasoid skull right here, and let me pick this up and bring it over here where we can look at some of the features of that skull. Caucasoid individuals are noted for having a very pointed face, a face that comes to a point along the midline. You can point this out by taking your pencil and putting it across the nose of the skull like this, and so that you can see this a little bit better, let's put the skull down here and we'll lay the pencil across the nose of that individual. Now note that I can get my finger between the pencil and the cheekbone of this Caucasoid skull without ever touching the pencil. Now, either one or 2 things have happened here. Either the cheekbones have not come very far forward, or the nose or the skeleton along the midline has come far forward. And it's probably a combination of both of these. Now, if you have thought about this, if you have any friends who are Mongoloids, Japanese, Chinese, and so forth, you will note that they have a round moon-like face. One of the reasons for this is that Mongoloids are the only race of humanity that is cold adapted. They live in the Himalayas, they live in the Arctic Circle, in other words, the Eskimo, they live in the Andes of Peru, the American Indians. If you live in a cold environment, you do not want things sticking out from the body. How many of you have ever seen a giraffe in the Arctic Circle? Obviously, a giraffe is not built for cold weather. He'd freeze his neck off in a situation like that. Individuals that live in a cold environment are usually round and roly-poly and don't have much sticking out from the body. Now let's go and take a look at a Mongoloid skull and show you the difference here. We'll take the Mongoloid skull and we'll put the pencil in the same place and we turn the skull around so it's in the same position that you looked at in the other, and you can get an idea of what we're talking about. If you find a skeleton, you wonder again whether it's Caucasoid or Mongoloid, Take your pencil and lay it across the nose of the individual like that. Try to insert your finger between the cheekbone and the pencil. Note that in this case, I cannot do that, and I will knock the pencil off of the skull if I go any further. What we're saying is that either in mongoloids the cheekbones have come very far forward, or the nose has not come very far forward, and it is probably a combination of both of these. Now, let's take this skull and put it back and look at another criteria that we want to be able to show you how you can determine the race of an individual. All of you who are looking at this, if you're Caucasoids, can take your pencil and you can touch the base of your nose and your chin at the same time. As Caucasoids, we do not have a protrusion of the mouth region. To show you that you can do this on the skull, note that I can touch the nose and the chin of this Caucasoid individual without any difficulty. In other words, what we're saying is that in the mouth region, Caucasoids have a very flat mouth region. Now, contrast to this are Negroid individuals, and let's put this skull down and pick up the Negroid skull and show you the difference there. Most of you know that Negroid individuals have thick lips. They not only have thick lips, but they have a bony protrusion that tends to protrude these already thick lips, such that if I touch the nose of that individual, that Negroid individual, note where my pencil comes in relationship to the chin, or if I touch the chin, note where my pen comes in relationship to the nose. This protrusion of the mouth region is known as prognathism, or a protrusion of the alveolar portions. This would be the part of the mandible and the maxilla into which the teeth fit, or that area that contains the root of the teeth is known as the alveolar region, and this is known as alveolar prognathism. Very common, very characteristic in black individuals. Now let's put this Negroid skull down, or reach over here really, and take the mandible off, because I want to show you a third criteria that we want to look at. While we're doing this, let me say that one of the things that I have noted that make a difference between a good criminal investigator and somebody who is not as good is whether the good criminal investigator is a good observer or not. A good criminal investigator are those individuals who see differences in the things of nature that they look at. Note the nasal structure of these individuals, or first I should say, let's take a look at the whole facial structure. Note that they both have eyes, they both have a nose, they both have a mouth. But now concentrate your view on the difference at the nose, or base of the nose, of those individuals. The skull on your right is a Negroid, or black individual, and the skull on your left is a white or Caucasoid individual. Now let me put the Negroid skull down, because I want to show you a characteristic there. I'll put the Negroid skull down, and we will take the pencil and we will go over here and take a look at the Caucasoid skull. Now what we were talking about just a minute ago is what is known as the nasal sill, or this little dam at the base of the nose. Note that I cannot get my pencil into the nose of this Caucasoid skull. The reason for this is a bony ridge, or what is called a nasal sill, which is very characteristic of white or Caucasoid individuals. Now, let's take this skull and put it back over there and replace this with a Negroid skull so that you can see the difference between the nasal sill and the Caucasoid. And we'll put this skull back over here now and take a look at the Negroid skull. We'll put it back in the same position here so that you have something to compare with. Note that there is no nasal sill in the Negroid individual, nothing to impede the progress of the pencil into the nose. That in a Negroid skull, if you are trying to determine what the race of that individual is, take your pencil and try to run it along the upper edge of the teeth, what is known as the alveolar portion of the maxilla. And in a Negroid individual, there will be no nasal sill at the base of the nose, and you can insert the pencil into the nose without any difficulty. Those of you that think about this and may wonder why something like this occurs, let me just give you a little background. Before man comes along to forcibly remove one group of people from one geographic area to another, Negroid or black individuals adapted themselves to the hotter or more humid parts of the species range. For example, Negroid individuals lived in Africa south of the Sahara Desert and in the Pacific area known as Melanesia. Now, if you are going to adapt to a hot environment, physiologically, what you want to do is to be able to exchange as much air from inside of the body to outside as possible. In a situation like this, then, you do not want obstructions in the nasal passage, and this characteristic of no nasal sill is an example of climatic adaptation, the adaptation of a group of individuals to a hot environment in which what you really do not want is an obstruction in the nasal passage. Now let's put this down and go back again to the Caucasoid skull so that you can see what happens to the Caucasoid ancestors who adapted themselves to the colder parts of the species range. And in a colder area, you do not want to breathe in the air that is too cold. So what you have is a nasal sill or a little compartment that has been a climatic adaptation of the ancestors of Caucasoid or white individuals, such that we breathe the air in, we hold it in this little compartment in the skull, and warm it up before we breathe it on into the lungs. Now this is just an example of all of these. This is an explanation of only one of these characteristics that I have been showing you. All right, let's take another look now at another characteristic, or a look at another characteristic. Note when we occlude the teeth of this Caucasoid skull, there is an overbite, or since there's some of the teeth are missing here, let me show you that when I bite down, that I have an overbite in which my upper teeth bite in front of my lowers. You can see there, this is a very common characteristic of most of us who have an overbite. Now, let's put this skull down and look at one of the Mongoloid skull, or look again at the Mongoloid skull. And one of the common characteristics of American Indians are that you have an edge-to-edge bite. This is where you have to be careful you don't drop something here when you're dealing with something like this. And by the way, you need to be careful in your investigation of cranial material, because skeletons are fragile and they will break, and if you drop them, then you've got a lot more pieces than what you started with. Note in this Mongoloid skull, this American Indian, that you have an edge-to-edge bite in the incisor region. Instead of having an overbite like you would have in Caucasoid or Negroids, American Indians have an edge-to-edge bite in the incisor region. If you find a skull and you look at the anterior teeth, these are the teeth which are the incisor teeth. If you have wear on the occlusal surface, you can almost bet that you have an American Indian. What you have there is the edge-to-edge bite of the wear between the lower incisors and the upper incisors, in that area right here. And this is a common characteristic among American Indians. Now let me caution you that when you find a skull, in most cases the anterior dentition will be missing. The reason for this is that the anterior teeth, the incisors, the four incisors and the canine, but specifically the four incisors, may be missing because as the body decays, the tissue holding the teeth into the root socket will decay and that tooth will fall out. You want to be very careful when you uncover skeletal material that you don't lose any of the front teeth. Or if you find a body in advanced state of decay and you go out there, it's not a very pleasant experience, not a very appetizing place to be, and many times you want to get the bones out and get away as quick as you can because of the smell. But be very careful that you look for the anterior teeth, because these are important in identification, they're important in determining the race of an individual, they're also important in determining a positive identification if all that exists of that individual are color photographs or black and white photographs of the individual smiling. Teeth have individual characteristics, and occasionally you can match these characteristics up from a skull with a photograph of the individual. All right, let's put the skull down now and talk about one other characteristic. Let me reach over here and get a tooth. We were talking about incisor teeth, and you all didn't know this from the lectures that we've had so far, but I excavated one summer in Texas, and this is the tooth of an Indian from Texas, if you wonder whether they have big teeth out there. In actuality, I taught my introductory course called Human Origins 3 times on television, and this was one of the props that we used in there. But it's a good prop to show another genetic characteristic that occurs in Mongoloid individuals. This would be American Indians, Japanese, Chinese individuals from Southeast Asia. And this is what is known as a shovel-shaped incisor. What we're looking at is the upper central incisor tooth, be like that, and this would be the gum, or this would be the cheek right here. And you're looking, in this case, at these 2 ridges on the edge of the tooth here. This has been termed a shovel-shaped incisor because of the ridges which occur on both sides of this tooth. And if you take the tooth out and hold it like you're looking at it there, it looks like an old scoop shovel, with this being the part of the shovel and these being the sides of the teeth. Now, shovel-shaped incisors are very common in Mongoloid individuals. So if you find a skull that has an edge-to-edge bite and shovel-shaped incisors, these are the ones that are in the front, the central, and also it can occur in the lateral incisors, then you can bet that you have a Mongoloid individual. This is a very common characteristic among those individuals, among Mongoloids, and is seldom seen among is seldom seen among Caucasoids or Negroid individuals. All right, let me put this back now and talk about one other thing that I'm sure people are going to have questions concerning. Remember when we started, we said that we wanted to look at something in this partial skull. One of the questions that people often ask when you're lecturing about the race of an individual is, are there differences in the thickness of the skull? What they're asking is, essentially, do some races have thicker skulls than do others? Well, the answer to this is no, not really. Now, this is complicated because if you put the skull down like this, you can see that there are variations in the thickness. For example, the skull is very thin right there, and it becomes very thick right here. If you were not scientific and you wanted to show that some individuals have thicker skulls than others, you could measure some individuals, particularly blacks, for example, have been said that they have thicker skulls than do other races, but anatomically and statistically this is not true. The thickness of the skull varies throughout the context or contour of the skull. If you measure in the same anatomical landmark in every skull, you will find that no race is statistically thicker than is any other race. However, there is something that does occur that is of interest and something that you can occasionally pick up when you're looking at skeletal material. I want to put this white skull down and pick up the Negroid skull just a minute. Negroid individuals are noted for having not a thicker skull, but a more dense skull. Actually, the entire skeleton of Negroid individuals is more dense. This has long been known by radiologists who are taking x-rays of bones, of skeletons, and since Negroid individuals have denser bone, it takes either a higher exposure or a longer exposure in order to get the same quality x-ray of a Negroid individual. If some of you bring me a skull sometime, you may see me sit and begin to rub the skull. Now, I'm not in love with the skull, but what I'm trying to feel here is the texture of the bone. If Negroid individuals have thicker skulls, and they do, that means that per square centimeter, they have more osteons or more bone cells per square centimeter than do individuals of the other races. This also indicates then that the bone is more ivory in texture. And what I'm trying to feel is the ivory texture of the bone. In other words, a Negroid skull will sometimes, now not all the time, but will sometimes feel like a piano key. The bone is so compact, so dense, that the bone really feels very smooth and compact. It feels like a piano key. Now, many of you have known about this, in another way. For example, let me ask you a question. How many of you know of a famous Negro swimmer? You know, Negroids are very good in athletics, particularly basketball and football, but how many of you can tell me the name of a famous Negro swimmer? You can't, because there are none. Negroid individuals make very poor swimmers because the skeleton is more dense and they have a tendency to sink at a much more rapid rate than do either Mongoloids or Caucasoids. Therefore, Negroid individuals, even though they live along the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, in Africa and in the Pacific Ocean, in Polynesia, in Micronesia, in Melanesia, and in this area, they do not make good swimmers. Now, let us now go from talking about the race of an individual, or how you determine the race. Maybe we should say again that the only area that you can determine the race of an individual is from the skull. There has been in the past some literature, for those of you that know the anthropological literature, stating that you may be able to determine the race of an individual from the anterior-posterior curvature of the femur. If I put the femur on the table like this, you can see that there is a curvature in this bone. However, the information dealing with the curvature of the femur is not such that you can really tell the race of the individual. The work that has been done has been on too small samples. The samples, by the way, have never compared right and left sides. They have never compared the difference between males and females, and they have never compared the difference between young adults or subadults and adult individuals. So this may be an area in which racial differences do exist, and it's certainly an area that I encourage my students to work on, doing master's thesis and doctoral dissertations, to see if there are areas. But right now, for our purposes, dealing with the identification of human skeletal material, I would say that the only area that we can tell the race of an individual is from the skull. Using the femur, though, the next thing we want to begin to talk about is determining the stature of an individual. How tall is that individual? Again, one of the questions that the law enforcement agents often ask when you go out to look at a skeleton, can you tell me how tall that individual is? Yes, we can tell you how tall that individual is, but let me caution you, as a law enforcement officer or as an anthropologist, if you're looking at this series of lectures, that what we are calculating is biological stature. This is the relationship, or the proportion, we should say, of the length of the long bones to the entire stature of the body. You will find that when we, as anthropologists, give you stature, that in many cases, if we have identified the individual, the stature we give you will be less than the stature that is recorded. This has been discussed in the literature, and I think is true for a number of reasons. The major reason is, though, that we tend to overestimate our stature. For some reason, individuals who are taller appear maybe a little more macho than other people, and therefore we tend to say that our stature is greater than what it actually is. Also, if any of you work in a law enforcement agency, you will know that when you take a mugshot of an individual, stand him in front of the camera with a slide in the back, a chart in the back on how tall the individual is, you never take their shoes off. So what you're doing is in your mugshots and in the information that occurs in police files on an individual, you're giving that individual stature with their shoes on. And what we're giving you is the biological stature without the shoes. Now, if you wonder what the stature of an individual is, you can take any of the long bones of the body. This is a femur, the bone in the upper leg, and it is better, by the way, to base stature on the legs than it is on the arms, although you can use the humerus or the radius and the ulna, either one of those, or you can use the two bones on the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula. But let's take this now and put it on what we call an osteometric board. An osteometric board is simply nothing more than a measuring device to measure the length of a bone, and we'll take this over and put it in the osteometric board right here, and you will see that the osteometric board is simply nothing more than a board with a stapled end right here and a movable end here. And what you want to do is to take the bone which you have and insert it into the osteometric board like this, and you want to swing the bone around so that you get the maximum length of the bone. Then what you do is you read the maximum length off of the scale, which is mounted on the base of the osteometric board, and from this maximum length of the femur you can calculate the stature using formulas which we have for all of the races and which will be included in the literature that you have dealing with this course. Again, remember that what we're doing when we calculate the stature is giving you the biological stature of the individual. This is the anatomical stature and is of that individual without shoes, and most of the data which you will have will be of individuals who have had their measurements taken with their shoes on if it's been in the police department. Okay, with that, let's close this segment, and thank you very much for being with us again. The next and the last segment we're going to deal with is going to be on investigation of fires and what happens to a body when it burns to death in a fire. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you next time.